Welcome to week 11 of this course. So we're really getting along, I think, pretty well. This is our last week on the Romans. By the time we get to next week, the Roman Empire will have basically be falling apart, and that's part of the story that I'm going to cover today in this video. Um, so the time period for this your West in the World reading for this week is sort of from the end of the Pax Romana, which we could say ends in 180 AD, to the year 410, which is a kind of year of infamy in Roman history because it's the year when Rome is sacked by the Visigoths. Doesn't mean that there's no more Roman Empire at that point, but the handwriting is on the wall. So that's what we're really concerned with here. How do you get from point A, which is the year 180, when the Roman Empire is firing on all cylinders, everything seems to be going very well. How do you get from that point to the point that the Romans are not even able to defend their own city? Their own city is occupied by a hostile army in 410. How did they get to that moment? Obviously, it's a long, complicated story, but I'm going to try to give you a sense of the big picture here. I think when we think about the sort of demise, the slow unraveling, if that's the right word, of the Roman Empire, it's always important to keep focused on the so-called barbarians. I'm not using the word barbarian as a value judgment. This was the term that Romans used to describe non-Romans. And of course, as the Roman Empire expands in the first and second centuries of the Common Era, there are some real positives that come with that. But the negative is, of course, now the Romans have thousands of miles of borders to protect. And that is going to turn out to be a very tall order indeed. You should have West in the World out in front of you, so go ahead and do that. And turn to page 150, and I want to sort of give you a sense of where these barbarians are located. If you look at the far eastern boundary of the Roman Empire, which is sort of orange colored, you'll see that just to the east of that boundary is the dominion of the Sassanids. And the Sassanids were the Persians. Okay, so it's the great Persian Empire. So the Romans are always going to be nervous about them. The Persians are not a force to be taken lightly. But in the end, it would turn out that the barbarians, who were in a very different part of the world, are really going to give Romans headaches. So look, find where sort of the Diocese of Gaul, which would be modern day France, and the Diocese of Italy meet. And you'll see two rivers there, two of the most important rivers in Europe. One is the Rhine, which basically flows south to north, and then the Danube, which flows from west to east. Those are going to be the borders of the empire that are going to be the most problematic for the Romans. They're going to be the most porous because the people who live on the other side of those rivers are Germanic peoples. There's a number of different tribes, different names, but they all spoke related languages that we call Germanic languages. Just to give you a couple of examples, the Visigoths, the Franks, the Vandals, and so on. Now, from the earliest days of the empire, those folks had been there. They were, in a sense, this was nothing new. But for reasons I don't want to get into, in the 3rd and 4th centuries, these peoples are going to be sort of forced to the very edge of the Roman Empire and are going to start putting some pressure on those borders. Um, as you might imagine, the Roman army is spread pretty thin at this point, with all those thousands of miles of borders to protect in Europe, Africa, and Asia, Western Asia. So one of the things you're going to be reading about in Western World this week is how the Romans, after the Pax Romana period, starting sort of in the late 2nd century, how the Romans are going to respond to this threat, the threat of barbarians on the borders. You're going to read about an emperor named Septimius Severus. And Septimius Severus, he decides that the real answer is to really revamp the army, expand it, make it bigger, make it better. Now, one of the ironclad laws of history is that all major projects or decisions or programs have unintended consequences, and this is no exception. There's going to be a number of economic and political consequences that flow from this militarization that starts with Septimius Severus. By the way, Septimius Severus rules from 193 to 211. And if you want to know how his name is spelled, you can find that on page 147. Okay, so I mentioned there would be some economic consequences. This makes a lot of sense, right? You have to feed soldiers. You have to pay soldiers in some way. So how are you going to raise the revenue to do that? Well, the most common way, of course, then and now, is through taxation. Okay, so there's going to be a heavier tax burden on at least many Romans. In order to pay soldiers, more coins had to be made, more hard currency had to be made. But of course, silver is scarce, and so what happens is that the coins themselves are debased gradually, so that by the 260s or so, there's actually barely any real silver in the Roman coin, the denarius, at all. So what does that mean? Well, it means the coins are going to be worth less because there are more of them. They have less precious metal in them. So, of course, we get inflation. And inflation, again, is usually most burdensome on the poor or on people with fixed incomes. So there's a real economic cost involved in this revamping of the Roman army. But there are political costs as well, and you're going to read about some of those. What happens is that now it's the army that will make or break emperors. So if you have your sights set on becoming Roman emperor, the best way you can do that is through the military. Rise to the top of the ranks, become a general, make your troops really loyal to you, remind them that they will benefit handsomely if you are emperor, and you'll be able to share your largesse with them. And so this is exactly what happens. In the 3rd century, virtually all of the emperors have some kind of background in the army. This is different from an earlier period in Roman history when the civilian branch of government and the military were more separate. So what happens is we have constant turnover of emperors. After the assassination of the emperor Severus Alexander in 235, for the next 50 years there was just chaos. In a 50-year period, there were 18 different emperors who were sanctioned by the Senate, and that's not even counting all of the usurpers and would-be emperors who tried to make a claim to the imperial throne. And again, most of these emperors are military men who have used their power in the army and used their own armies to catapult them to power. So we're kind of back to the bad old days of the late Roman Republic, because we have Roman armies fighting other Roman armies, each Roman army loyal to their general, hoping that their general will become emperor so that they might benefit as well. So 3rd century is by and large a fairly rough century for the Romans. Now, toward the end of that century, an emperor comes into power who is able to at least temporarily provide some stability. You'll read about him. His name is Diocletian. Now, you'll be hearing about Diocletian in my lecture on early Christianity as well, because he has a very important role to play in the history of the early church. But I'm not going to talk about that right now. So be looking for some of the improvements that he wants to make to the Roman Empire, and his strategies for solving some of the problems that have been plaguing the Roman Empire for quite some time. I'll just mention one of those strategies, and that is the implementation of the tetrarchy, literally the rule of 4. I won't explain what that is because you'll read all about it. I'll just say this. The tetrarchy was instituted to solve two problems that no one had been able to solve for quite some time. The first was really a problem from the very beginning of the Roman Empire, and that is succession. So an emperor dies. Okay, well, how do you decide who becomes emperor next? That was always a kind of sticky situation. So it was intended to help solve that problem and solve the problem that comes with having only one man govern an empire as gargantuan as the Roman Empire. So you'll read about the Tetrarchy, and you also read about some of the economic edicts that Diocletian passed in order to solve some of the economic problems of the Roman Empire. One other thing I want to say about Diocletian before moving on, Diocletian, I think, embodies a kind of tendency we see from this point on in the Roman Empire, which was a growing autocracy. Autocracy means that, almost all power is sort of concentrated into one figure, the figure of the emperor himself. So even though it's true, of course, that in the early days of the empire, the Senate, for example, did not have nearly the kind of power it did back in the early days of the Republic. Well, by this point, by Diocletian's rule, the Senate is almost completely impotent. Okay, so there's that, and then there's also the fact that Diocletian himself saw himself as a kind of mystical religious figure. He wanted to be called by the title Dominus, which means Lord. So none of that sort of fake humility we saw with Augustus. No, he sees himself as sort of set apart from everyone else, and indeed holy in a very real sense. In a way, the next emperor, Constantine, embodies that very same trend toward autocracy. You'll hear more about Constantine again in my lecture on early church history. For now, I'll just mention the fact that he establishes a new imperial capital in what used to be called Byzantium. He founds a new, or sort of remakes that city, and it ends up taking his name, so it becomes known as Constantinople, or the polis of Constantine. And I think this is important to mention because it illustrates the trend, which was that Rome itself, the city of Rome itself, was becoming less and less important as the Roman Empire went along, partly because it was too far removed from some of those pressure points that I was talking about earlier. Um, so Diocletian, Constantine, these are emperors who rule for several decades. They provide some much needed stability and order, but ultimately were unable to solve or at least offer a permanent solution to the problem of the barbarians. Um, Germanic peoples were continuing to sort of encroach on those borders I was talking about a moment ago, the Rhine border, the Danube border. For a time, the Romans thought, well, maybe we can make this work for us. Maybe we can make a virtue out of necessity. Maybe we can conscript um, a lot of these barbarians into our army, and they'll fight for us, and then and we'll let them live on our land and that sort of thing. So the idea was we'll beef up the army without having to raise taxes. So that seemed like a good thing. The problem was that the Romans just treated these Germanic peoples pretty badly, often did not hold up their end of the bargain. And so that just didn't go very well. And eventually, some of the Germanic peoples begin to revolt against the Romans, including some that were fighting as part of the Roman army, who eventually just get fed up with their mistreatment and rebel. Um, Perhaps most famously, the Goths, one of these Germanic tribes, rebel in 378. They fight Emperor Valens, Valens, um, and they actually they kill him on the battlefield. They kill the Roman emperor in battle. So that kind of broadcast the vulnerability of Rome to the world. This is not the sort of thing that makes for very good publicity when your emperor is killed in battle trying and failing to subdue these restless barbarians. And of course, as I said early on, it will just be a few decades after this that a very similar situation happens with the Visigoths. They were led by a man named Alaric, Alaric. Alaric had been fighting for the Roman army. He had worked his way up in the Roman ranks, and again became just fed up with the way the Romans were treating him and his people. And as a result, he and his army sack the city of Rome in the year 410. Now they were only there in the city for a few days, but the city of Rome had not been occupied by a foreign enemy for about 900 years. Okay, so you'd have to go back into the mists of time to think of the last time that Rome had been sacked. So I think a lot of people realize that this is not a good portent of things to come. And indeed, by the year 476, so 66 years later, uh, the Western Roman Empire is no more. By this time, the Roman Empire had officially been divided into an eastern and western half. The eastern half will actually survive for another millennium, and that comes to be known as the Byzantine Empire, Byzantine. But the western half of the Roman Empire, the half that actually has Rome in it, that will collapse entirely by the year 476. So that's just to kind of guide you through that West in the World reading, which is not a long reading, but I want you to think about the big picture. Your reading also includes a discussion of some of the religious and philosophical options that were open to Roman people in the later imperial period. So there's a discussion of Judaism, and you'll be reminded that Judaism was not a monolithic thing. There were various different sort of types of Judaism available. You'll also read about a very interesting phenomenon known as the mystery religions. There's a number of these mystery religions that become quite popular in the imperial period. And so I'll let you read about them. But here's one question that you definitely need to be able to answer. And that is, what makes these mystery religions different from traditional Roman religion, traditional Roman polytheistic religion? What makes mystery religions different? And what does that word mystery mean? One thing I will say, because I want this to come through very clearly, mystery religions were not intended as a substitute or replacement for traditional Roman religion, rather as a kind of supplement to it. So keep that in mind. You also read about a couple of philosophical schools that were very popular at this time. Stoicism, no big surprise there, given the fact that Marcus Aurelius was such a big fan. You'll also read a little bit about Neoplatonism. You're not actually going to read anything in Western the world about Christianity. And of course, this is one of the huge stories of the late imperial period, how Christians go from a tiny minority to the official religion of the Roman Empire. But the main reason we don't assign that section of Western the world, well, first of all, it's got some problems, but also the lecture that I give on the rise of Christianity is meant to kind of give you that big picture, bird's eye view. So be sure to go ahead and watch that whenever you have a chance. And I think I'll try to remind you again, but the next video for this week is going to be on Polycarp and Augustine, two primary source readings. And I strongly urge you to go ahead and watch my Rise of Christianity lecture first before you even watch that video, much less do the readings. So that would be my advice. All right, thank you.